It's 2:47 a.m. You've been staring at the ceiling for an hour when your phone lights up on the nightstand. You don't need to look to know who it is. Your body already knows that familiar tightening in your chest. Somewhere between anticipation and dread, you told yourself this was over. You meant it this time. You deleted the photos, rearranged your apartment, started sleeping on the other side of the bed. You were moving on, but now your thumb hovers over that notification, and something in you already knows what you're going to do, because you've been here before. Maybe 3 times, maybe 7. And some part of you understands that knowing better has never been enough to stop this. Today, we're going to talk about why. Let me tell you about someone we'll call Marcus. The details have been changed, but the pattern is real, because this pattern is always real. Marcus is 34, works in finance, runs half marathons, has a small but solid group of friends he's known since college. By most external measures, his life is together. He makes decisions confidently at work. He's the one friends call when they need someone steady. But for the past 4 years, he's been caught in something that makes no sense to him. He met her at a conference in 2020. They dated for 10 months, the longest relationship he'd had in years. When she ended it, citing uncertainty about what she wanted, Marcus was blindsided. But he accepted it, started the familiar process of moving on, deleted her number, went to therapy for a few sessions, told his friends he was fine. 7 weeks later, she texted. They got back together. For 5 months, things felt different, more open, more intentional. Then the same distance crept back in, the same conversations that went nowhere. She pulled away again. This time, he ended it. Felt like he'd taken back some control, but 4 months after that, he found himself typing her name into his phone at 1 a.m. They met for drinks. One thing led to another. This cycle has repeated 6 times over 4 years. Each breakup felt final. Each reunion felt like clarity. And each time Marcus found himself back in it, he noticed something slipping away inside him, something harder to name than heartbreak. When he finally described it to a close friend, he said something I haven't been able to forget. I don't know if I'm in love with her, or if I just don't know how to stop. And honestly, I can't tell which one is worse. So what's actually happening here? Why do self-aware, intelligent people find themselves repeating a pattern they can clearly see? The answer starts with understanding something about how your brain processes connection. In stable relationships, your nervous system eventually calibrates to consistency. You feel secure, and over time, that security becomes a baseline, comfortable, but neurologically quiet. The intense feelings of early romance settle into something steadier. On-off relationships never allow this calibration to complete. Instead, your attachment system stays in a state of constant activation. Every withdrawal triggers a threat response. Your brain registers the loss of connection as danger, almost like losing access to a survival resource. And every return floods your system with relief, dopamine, and the neurochemistry of reward. This is what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that makes slot machines compelling. The unpredictability of the reward doesn't diminish the pull, it amplifies it. Your brain becomes more attentive, more fixated, more desperate to predict and secure the next positive outcome. Marcus isn't weak. He's not lacking insight. His nervous system has been conditioned by 4 years of inconsistent availability to treat this relationship as the most important thing in his environment. His body has learned to equate her presence with safety and her absence with emergency. And here's where it gets more complicated. This activation often gets confused with love. Because the lows are so low, the highs feel extraordinary by contrast. That relief when she comes back starts to feel like passion. That anxiety when you don't know where you stand starts to feel like desire. The relationship doesn't necessarily produce more love, it produces more intensity. And we're not always good at telling the difference. Marcus has been in calmer relationships, He described them as nice but flat. What he didn't recognize was that flat might have been what peace actually feels like. His nervous system had become so calibrated to chaos that stability registered as absence. There's a concept that helps explain why on-off relationships rarely evolve into something stable, no matter how many chances you give them. Think of every relationship as having what we might call a repair budget, an internal reservoir of goodwill, trust, and emotional energy that gets spent whenever damage occurs. Arguments, disappointments, betrayals, misunderstandings, all of these make withdrawals from this budget. And in healthy relationships, the budget gets replenished through consistency, reliability, and genuine follow-through over time. On-off relationships operate in chronic deficit. Every breakup is a significant withdrawal. It says, "This wasn't working, and I chose to leave." Every reconciliation promises to restore trust, but rarely deposits enough to offset what was taken. Because the reconciliation period is usually intense but short, it's all repair attempts and renewed hope without the long, boring stretch of consistency required to actually rebuild. Marcus noticed this happening, even if he didn't have language for it. By the fourth cycle, the reunions felt less like new beginnings and more like returning to a house you keep trying to renovate but never quite finish. The conversations were shorter. The hope had a thinner quality. Both of them were going through familiar motions, but something essential had been worn down. What makes this worse is that the pattern tends to accelerate rather than stabilize. Each cycle teaches both people that endings aren't permanent, that there's always another chance, that leaving doesn't really mean leaving. This removes the natural weight that finality provides. Without that weight, the cycles spin faster. The gaps between breakups shrink. The triggers become smaller. The ability to repair diminishes with each rotation. By year 4, Marcus could go from "this is working" to "we're done" in the span of a weekend. Not because the problems were bigger, but because the infrastructure of trust had become too thin to absorb even minor stress. Now, I want to spend some time on something that rarely gets examined carefully: what this pattern actually does to a man's internal experience. Not to position men as victims, but because understanding this is essential to understanding why the loop continues. There's a specific kind of erosion that happens when you repeatedly return to something you've decided to leave. Each time Marcus went back, something inside him shifted. Not dramatically, not in ways others could see, but quietly, structurally, like hairline cracks spreading through a foundation. The first time he returned, he could tell himself it was love. The second time, it was giving the relationship a real chance. By the third and fourth time, he started to feel something he struggled to name. It wasn't quite sadness. It wasn't anger. It was more like a loss of internal credibility. Here's what I mean. We all carry an internal narrative about who we are. Part of Marcus's identity was being someone who knew his own mind, who made decisions and followed through. Every time he went back after saying he was done, that narrative eroded. He began to feel like his own word meant nothing. Not to her, to himself. This is one of the hidden costs of the on-off pattern that almost never gets discussed. The damage isn't just to the relationship, it's to the relationship you have with yourself. When you repeatedly act against your own stated intentions, you start to lose faith in your capacity to act at all. You become unreliable to yourself. And that kind of self-betrayal accumulates quietly until you wake up one morning and realize you don't recognize the person making your decisions. Then there's the hope. And hope, in this context, is a complicated thing. Marcus kept returning partly because he genuinely believed each time could be different. And this wasn't delusion. The reconciliation periods often were better. More communication, more vulnerability, more apparent effort. The problem was that these improvements never sustained. They were real, but temporary, and having glimpsed what good looked like made it almost impossible to accept that it couldn't last. You're not just leaving a person when you walk away from this. You're leaving the possibility of the thing you almost had. That's a different kind of grief, mourning not what was, but what kept almost being. And beneath all of this, there's the loneliness. This one is harder to talk about because men are often conditioned to frame being alone as freedom, rather than absence. But the truth is, Marcus had organized part of his life around this relationship. His weekends, his future plans, his sense of having someone. Every breakup meant confronting that emptiness. And the gap between I'm choosing to be single and I'm alone again can feel enormous, even when they look identical from the outside. The fear of that absence isn't weakness, it's human. And it operates beneath conscious awareness, quietly pushing you back toward a familiar pattern, even when everything logical in you knows better. So, if both people keep coming back, if there's clearly something pulling them together, why doesn't it eventually work? This is where looking honestly at the pattern becomes painful. On-off relationships don't usually end because love disappears. They end because capacity disappears. The repair budget doesn't just run low, it eventually runs out. Marcus described the final cycle differently than the others. The reunion wasn't hopeful, it was tired. The familiar conversations felt like scripts they'd both memorized. Even the physical intimacy had a going through the motions quality, like two people recreating something that used to mean more. What ends these patterns isn't usually insight. It's exhaustion. By the time Marcus finally stopped, he wasn't doing it because he'd figured something out. He wasn't stronger or wiser. He was just empty. The part of him that had energy for hope, for trying again, for believing this time could be different. That part had been depleted below the threshold required to continue. And that kind of ending isn't triumphant. It's not a breakthrough. It's more like setting something down that's gotten too heavy to carry, not because you've decided to, but because your arms simply gave out. If any of this sounds familiar, if you see yourself in Marcus, or in the pattern, or in that 2 a.m. moment of hovering over a notification, you shouldn't open. I want to offer you something that isn't advice. Exactly. Just an observation. We tend to ask the wrong question about these relationships. We ask, is this person right for me? Or, can we make it work this time? But maybe the more honest question is, what is this pattern doing to my relationship with myself? Because relationships end. People leave our lives, sometimes permanently, but you are the one constant in your own story. And if something, any relationship, any pattern, is systematically eroding your ability to trust your own word, to stand behind your own decisions, to recognize your own reflection, that cost matters. It might matter more than whether the relationship works. This isn't about blame. It's not about deciding who was more wrong. It's about recognizing that some patterns, regardless of how they started or whose fault they are, take something from you that you can't afford to lose. Marcus didn't leave because he had a moment of clarity. He left because one morning he looked in the mirror and realized the person looking back had become someone who couldn't keep a promise to himself about anything. And that recognition, quiet, unglamorous, exhausted, was the first honest thing he'd felt in months. Sometimes you don't leave because you've healed. You leave because staying has finally cost more than you have left to spend. I'm curious about something, and I'd genuinely like to hear from you. If you've been in an on-off relationship, and if you eventually got out of it, what was the thing that finally made the difference? Was it a specific moment? Something someone said? Was it exhaustion? Or was it quieter than that something that shifted in you that you couldn't quite explain, even to yourself? There's no right answer. I'm not looking for success stories or proof of growth. I'm just trying to understand what actually happens in those moments when someone finally steps out of the loop. Because I think there's something important there, something that might help someone who's still inside it. Staring at a notification at 2 a.m., Not sure what they're about to do? Leave a comment if you're willing to share. And if you're not ready to talk about it yet, that's fine too. Some things take time to find the words for.